Good morning. Welcome to the garden. I'm glad you're all here today. And I am particularly glad that one particular person, you're all special, you're all very special. But I need to tell you that Steve Schaffner is here this morning. Steve is a gardener who's been a gardener a long, long time. He, as many of you know, has been struggling with 2 types of leukemia and multiple other issues and has just been battling this for a number of years. Steve called this week. Today he is leukemia free. Steve, where are you? Where are you? There he is. We've all in one way or another been a part of his journey. He's shared with us several times here at the garden about what this has been like for him. And right now he's trying to, I think, get his mind around a whole new reality and what that might be like for him. So our prayers and love continue with you, Steve. So thanks. Thanks you all for honoring him. Well, in preparing for today, I happened upon another blog. This one had a question there that was this: what would the world be like without you? Now, I don't know if you've ever really thought about that question, but I thought it was worthy of our consideration this morning because it leads us down the road of thinking about why we're really here, what our purpose in life is, and what impact, if any, we're making on this world. Now, the writer of that blog also asked a couple of other questions that I kind of modified for my own use, but one of her questions is this: how many lives do you touch in the course of your lifetime? But I wonder, how many lives do we touch in the course of a regular day or a week's time? How many lives do we touch in the process of living our entire lives? And are there times that we have perhaps intervened in a way that may have saved someone's life? How many times do we cause someone to laugh or in some way or another help them make a decision that moves forward? Now, there are all kinds of ways, I think, in which it does matter that we are here, that we're a part of this world. But I have to tell you, there's sometimes when I read and hear about all the stuff that's going on in the world that it really kind of gets me down. And with everything that's happening, I kind of sometimes wonder, what on earth can a person like me do to make any kind of difference, to change anything at all? And it can almost be paralyzing at times. And I suppose it can get so overwhelming. You know, we see the newscast, we hear the news, and all this stuff comes at us to the point that we may become insensitive to it and kind of get complacent and develop apathy around the whole thing. And yet, while we're kind of standing on the sidelines, or on autopilot, if you will, people still continue to be hungry, and violence continues to erupt, and our communities disintegrate, and our nature tends to disappear. The beauty of nature disappears. I suppose it's possible for us to even slip into cynicism to the point that we begin to think, well, we can't trust anybody. We don't have faith in anybody else. And see, I told you. And that all politicians are corrupt, and that companies and corporations are just in it for their own bottom line, their own profit there. And it can get to the point that we see all this stuff happening around us, but we're never provided with any viable means for doing anything about it. However, I have a sense that it doesn't have to be that way for us. And I think if we are people of faith, and by that I mean if we're people who don't just talk about faith, but really try to live our faith, there can be another way. And I think perhaps that Paul, writing to the Galatians, is trying to explain what another way might look like. You see, the Galatians were giving in to all the tendencies around them, and Paul is trying to encourage them to live differently. And he encourages them to follow the guidance of the Spirit. And he does that by trying to describe what that looks like. He tries to kind of define what he thinks the Spirit is. And this is how our passage reads. But the Spirit produces love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, humility, and self-control. There is no law against such things as these. Now, the way I understand that passage is if you and I embody some of those gifts of the Spirit, things like love, joy, patience, goodness, kindness, those kinds of things, Our lives already count. It is important that we share those lives because we touch one another. We touch other people, even in tiny little ways, but that does make a difference. And what that says to me is that in some way we have to be willing to take responsibility for our fellow human beings. Now, the writer of that blog I mentioned gave a couple of examples of how she understood that particular thing. She talked, for example, about being in a grocery store. And she happened to be on an aisle where there was the peanut butter. And the shopper next to her was about to pull down a jar of peanut butter that had been recalled. And so, not knowing exactly what to do, she told the other shopper about the recall. And so the person put the jar back on the shelf and chose another jar instead. Now, the writer said, who knows if that made any difference at all. If she bought that peanut butter, maybe her family wouldn't have gotten sick. But she had to think that maybe at least sharing that piece of information was part of why she was here, a reason for her being. Then she shared another example. She said that she ran down the street chasing a boy whom she knew to be homeless and hungry, and that she had a sandwich in her hand and gave that to him. Now, again, she said she didn't know if that helped a little bit with his hunger or if in some way or another it might have kept him from stealing from somebody else in order to get something to have food for that day. But she wrote this: I'm not trying to make myself out as some sort of hero, not at all. I'm just an average person who tries to live as a decent human being, despite my rants and the things that aggravate me. Now, one of the things that kind of interested me in reading this blog happened to be the responses that came back to the writer. And there were all kinds of things that people mentioned in what would the world be like if you know, without you, if you weren't here. One person wrote about how every parent could, in fact, see how they had contributed to the world, and that's through their children. You know, children bring us the whole potential for hope and for what the future could hold for us. And they provide so much joy and so much laughter in our lives and so much love that does, in fact, matter. It makes a difference. Someone else wrote about introducing her two of her friends to their current mates and how they had been able to find and experience love in a way they never had before. Again and again and again, people talked about how they felt it was important that they were here, that they had a role to play in this world. And very often, it was the teeny tiniest little acts of kindness that they had shared, sometimes that they weren't even aware of, and sometimes that they never knew at all what kind of impact it made. I wonder if that's what Gandhi meant when he said this: it's the action, not the fruit of the action, that's important. You have to do the right thing. It may not be in your power, may not be in your time that there'll be any fruit, but that doesn't mean you stop doing the right thing. You may never know what results come from your action, but if you do nothing, there will be no result. Our lives matter. Our lives matter every time we reach out and touch another person. Just ask a woman from Fishers and her 6-year-old daughter about the 4 strangers who went into the water to try to save her and her daughter from their car that was sinking in the freezing water of a pond. You know, without those 4 persons reaching out to help and acting at that time, it's very likely that she and her daughter would not be here today. You know, that's a pretty dramatic example of how important each of our lives is to other people in this world. But there are the tiniest little things, too. Every time we offer a word of encouragement to a friend, or give a shoulder for someone to cry on, or offer a kind word to a stranger, that makes a difference. It is important that we're here. Every act, every word, every deed that we show is a way that we can embody and share God's love and those gifts of the Spirit. You see, what we're talking about here is that little phenomenon that's called the ripple effect. You know what I mean. You take a pebble and you throw it in the water, and you see this little plop as it goes in the water. And no matter how large or how small it is, watch. And then you see the ripples going out and out and out. That's what it's like when you and I embody God's love, when we live lovingly of every person we encounter, and we do all those things that the gifts of the Spirit tell us to do, to share joy and patience and love and kindness and goodness and more and more and more. It's when we do that that we can share God's love, and it will spread farther and farther out into the world. You know, part of living out God's Spirit, I think, has to do with the way we look at one another, the way we see one another in this world. And it's important, I think, that we really understand that in God's eyes, every single human being has worth and value because God has created us. Each one of us is a child of God. And if we're going to live with God's love within us that we're sharing, then it's important that we try to look through God's eyes too, that we see everyone as a child of God and as our brother and sister in the world. I read an article that was written by Donald Hancock where he was trying to help us understand and appreciate the value and worth of every single person. And he wrote at the beginning of this article about taking two bills out of his pocket. He took a $1 bill and a $100 bill. And he looked at them and said, okay, they're the same size. They have about the same amount of ink on them. They weigh about the same thing. But why is it that one of them is worth 100 times more than the other one? And his point was that they have that worth because people have agreed that that's what something's worth. Then his point that he was trying to make is that our worth is already established because God has given us worth and value. And each one of us is a child of God, loved by God, just like there were only one of us. God loves each and every one of us. That is so hard sometimes for us to get our minds and our heads around, I think. But I truly believe that's real. I think often about the first creation story, you know, the 7-day story in Genesis. And when God made all the other parts of the world, all the other parts of creation, God called them all good. But when humanity was made, God called us very That's worth. That's value. That's critically, terribly important for us to remember and to understand about every single person we encounter. You know, that helps us, I think, honor one another and honor ourselves and use that wonderful worth and value that has been bestowed upon us. Now, you know and I know that we're all different, and sometimes our worth gets a little tarnished, or sometimes it gets buried. But it's really amazing what a kind word, what a little sign of love will do to rub a little of that tarnish off and reveal a beautiful human soul. I have a friend who's also a friend of the garden who has been doing that in his own way over the last 2 or 3 years, I suppose. You may remember Jerry Herships, who's been here a couple of times to share messages here at the garden. For the last year and a half, he's been doing a very unconventional ministry in Denver that's called After Hours Denver. And they meet on Monday nights in one pub or a bar or another across the city. Now, Jerry's personal passion has been to help take care of those who are homeless and hungry. And there are many of them who live in the parks in Denver. And so because of this passion, others have begun sharing his passion. And the After Hours Denver folks each week either bring or make, after the service, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to take to the parks to share with those who are hungry. Because of them, because they're here, because they're doing this tiny little thing of making a PB&J sandwich, there are fewer people hungry in Denver. Now, just as an FYI, the After Hours Denver has decided to take their show on the road, so to speak, and they've engaged others, including the garden, to take on this idea of making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to serve to those who are hungry all across the nation. They have groups and individuals and churches and all kinds of organizations engaged in this whole process from coast to coast, and you'll hear more about it as more details are worked out. But I do hope that every single one of us will choose to be a part of that, because without us, somebody won't get any food. You see, the world would be a lesser place without you and you and you and you and every single one of us. It's important that we're here. Every one of us counts. We all have a role to play. We can make a difference. We can truly change things. I really like the words that Buckminster Fuller said. Never forget that you are one of a kind. Never forget that if there weren't any need for you and all your uniqueness to be on this earth, you wouldn't be here in the first place. And never forget, no matter how overwhelming life's challenges and problems seem to be, that one person can make a difference in the world. In fact, it is always because of one person that all the changes that matter in the world come about. So be that one person. To that, I say, amen.